I'm Lily Moayeri. I'm one of Mix's regular contributors. We have Will Bates of Fall on Your Sword with us, who has scored quite a few of the films and series that are on heavy rotation right now on streaming services. You might have seen his work on Netflix's Unbelievable and Away, which just premiered this month. He also scored the Hulu docuseries Hillary on Hillary Clinton and the HBO documentary Elizabeth Holmes, Inventor, Out for Blood in Silicon Valley, which you haven't seen, I highly recommend. I watched that even before I interviewed Will. And then when I interviewed him, I'm like, oh, that movie was great. Couldn't stop talking about it after I saw it. Will, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
So tell us a bit about your musical background and about your production company and your music company, Fall on Your Sword, and how you got into the whole scoring game.
Sure thing. Well, it's kind of all over the place. I guess the main thing that happened to me was very, very early on. When I was about 6 years old, I sang the whole score of Star Wars to my parents, and they went out and bought me a violin and kind of encouraged me to get into music. And I think just from that moment, music and film were always the beginning of everything for me. Like the way that music can flip a scene on its head. And I think I just kind of, when I discovered that one man was responsible for writing all of the pieces of music that I grew up with, Star Wars and, Superman and Indiana Jones, like, what, that's all one dude? That's crazy. So I kind of like went down this rabbit hole quite early on in life, and then got distracted. I was terrible at the violin, so I gave that up. And then when I was about 11, I started playing the saxophone, and I really took to that, and I got very into jazz, and I thought I was going to be Cannonball Adderley when I grew up. And was like gigging in cafes and bars in West London, closing down venues. That's something that I'm very proud of. I've closed down, I think, maybe 40 something different terrible little cafes in West London. Me and my buddies masquerading as 18-year-olds, and we were like 14 or 15 playing dodgy bebop. But I carried on doing that until I was about 19 and was really serious about it. I really thought I was going to be a sax player. And then I kind of discovered production, and that whole time I was dabbling. I had like a little Atari ST and an Akai sampler that I bought when I was maybe 13 or 14. And I was always kind of dabbling with electronic music and making weird noises. And gradually that overtook the saxophone. And I think by the time I was 19, I like discovered electronic music and started releasing records in London, dance music. And then I kind of left London at the age of 22, moved to New York, and was the lead singer of a band for a while, wrote a lot there. So everything is just kind of all over the place. And I guess the one thread has always been that the only way that I've known how to make any money is scoring to picture. So straight out of college, I got a gig in London, like writing for a music house, doing commercials. Won my first couple of jobs. I had a crazy gig producing one of the last Mike and the Mechanics albums, which is so random, but Mike was very helpful, and kind of like I learned a lot in that process. That was quite a long process. It went on for about a year, and with the money that I made from that job, that's how I moved to New York. But yeah, I guess I've always supported myself somehow or other through music. I've never had a proper job, which is sort of a good and bad thing, I guess. So despite having all of these kind of random projects and things that I've done and different disciplines, I've always scored to picture. And then when I moved to New York, I got another job in a music house writing music for commercials. Did that for about 7 years, won some awards, and then I kind of started to get slowly more into scoring movies. And I think I always rather naively thought that scoring commercials would be a route into scoring film, which of course is totally wrong. What it did taught me, it taught me all sorts of, like production skills and speed. We would get a brief in the morning and it would need to be done by, late afternoon, like crazy stuff. And I think in the end that was really good for me. I think I started getting very frustrated that the two worlds wouldn't kind of coalesce. So I would find myself, staying at the studio late and scoring these little movies, a couple of which I was lucky enough to go to Sundance with, and that's kind of how Fall on Your Sword got born. I that frustration of like, why can't there be a thing that I can have all of these projects and allow them to be under one roof and allow things to cross-pollinate, so that when I do an advertising campaign for a director, he or she would bring me along to the TV show that might happen next that they might be doing, or the movie. So that forging those relationships and kind of seeing how things can develop from one project to the next was really the impetus for starting a business that would allow me to kind of do all of that stuff. And I happened to be doing these random video art things on YouTube, a few of which went viral under the name Fall on Your Sword, and a band kind of was created out of it. It's like a 3-piece electronic band, and we would play kind of promoting the YouTube success, or like along with the YouTube success, we'd play with like video stuff behind us, and it just made sense to call the company the same thing. And then it evolved, and now it really is the sort of umbrella for a lot of the stuff that I do. And some parts of the company are now sort of operating without my involvement, and other parts I'm very involved in. But it's lovely for me to be able to kind of, if I'm creating an art installation, or I'm doing, if there's a team of composers working on commercials or whatever, that we can kind of use it all as one home. And of course the studios where I work are called Fall on Your Sword. So that's really the main thing. But in the end, I think that thread throughout all of this madness has been scoring to picture. And that's where, I'm happy that I finally I got there in the end, you know what I mean? So
it's interesting because you've kind of formalized what everybody, like anytime I talk to anyone about, oh, how did you get this job scoring whatever it is, it's always someone who knew them from something else, or someone who recommended them that worked with them somewhere else. And you've kind of formalized that all with Fall on Your Sword, where it's just like, well, here we go. It all comes into this one hub. And as you said, it does so many different things, including art stuff. But one of the things that we talked about during our interview for Mix is how your inspiration is sounds, which sounds vague, but it's really not. That's the start of your melodies, starts a whole bunch of other sounds that go with your score. And each of these are, of course, very unique to each project that you work on. Can you explain a little bit more about the whole source of inspiration?
Absolutely. It would be very easy for me to just kind of sit behind the piano and come up with a melody. And, I would say that in the early phases of me as a composer, that was very much how I would write, and then take those melodies and kind of transfer them to instrumentation. But something that I discovered from just working and things that excite me and things that have always interested me are discovering those sounds. And it's sort of become almost a routine way of me working now, where I will really go down a crazy rabbit hole trying to find some weird thing. And it might be like a 15-second little loop. It might be a one-shot kind of loop. It might be something that I can cycle, essentially, something that I can always have sitting in Logic that's revolving around and around, that I can then experiment with and lay stuff on top. And I think finding that first piece is really the fun part, and also the torturous part. Like we all think at the beginning of a project, like there's no way there's another melody out there, they've all been done, but somehow there just always is. And sometimes that happens instantly, and sometimes it takes a while and it's a bit of a struggle. But I love that part of the process. And I think that finding that soup at the beginning is the part that makes the unique voice of that project. And sometimes that would be like, I just got this great synth, or I've got this cool weird signal path that I want to experiment with, or this movie's set in a weird place, so why don't I go and buy an instrument and vaguely figure out how to make it sound musical and create some kind of soup out of that. And that's really where it always begins for me. And I love that. And somehow melody just kind of gets born out of those things that like really turn me on. Like, oh, that's a thing. Like you kind of know when you've landed on something, and I kind of can't wait to find a thing that I can play with two hands and throw the harmonic context out and like make it kind of feel different. You know what I mean? So it's exciting to me. Unbelievable was, you know, all about the picked piano and finding those kind of strange cycling things for Marie, and the more kind of clinical passages with the cops. I just did a movie called Raja, and that was set in 19th century Borneo. Really amazing movie, and also my first kind of period film, which is really fun. So that, obviously it's like a smallish ensemble. It's like a quintet, string quintet, but also a lot of strange atmospheric stuff. So I got very involved in communicating with some people in Sarawak about instruments, and I had a guy build me a thing called a sarpe, which you probably can't see it, but it's over there. It's this sort of long lute thing, and it's like one sympathetic string and then one melodic string, and you can kind of, after a couple of hours of messing about on it, you can kind of start to vaguely make it sound okay. I feel like I've made a career out of being all right at doing that. But in the end, with that, I found myself kind of playing it into different modules and creating these very beautiful long sort of pads and beds that then I would put my orchestral stuff on top of. So that's kind of another example of like trying to find that very unique timbre that's, you know, specific. And that in some ways, projects like TV shows or movies that are regional, it's easier to kind of figure that out. It's like, oh yeah, like I'm going to Google Borneo and Sarawak. What's a sarpe? Who plays that? Oh, I find there's a guy called Matthew who lives in the jungle that builds them. So we just, you know, start communicating. I used to have there was a shop, it's still around actually. When I was living in New York, there's a place called the Music Inn in the West Village. And it's run by this like really cantankerous, amazing dude who used to charge you $5 to walk in there. He doesn't do that anymore. But I'd walk in there and be like, I'm about to do a thing that's, I did a show called The Looming Tower, and, you know, there's like some passages in Morocco. What have you got from Morocco? And there's some stuff from Turkmenistan. Like, what do you suggest? And you'd like go in the back and pull out all this random stuff. And it could be a bell, or it might be like again, another weird like dulcimer or lute or something. And I've like created quite a crazy collection of stuff through that process of finding those things. We have a little area in the back of the studio called the orphanage, which is where all that stuff goes to die once it gets used. But it's like a museum. It's pretty cool.
Not die, just
kind of retire. Temporary retirement. Totally. Yeah.
It breaks my heart to think of instruments dying.
Well, I say that because sometimes when I buy this stuff, especially from that guy in the West Village, it would already be kind of half broken.
Oh, right.
Like things would already need to be restrung or whatever. So I would be the one that would be having the last hurrah with it in some cases. There you go, you're back. Okay.
There's some parts, like one of the examples that I'm going to say that again. One of the examples that I really liked that you gave me was how you came up with the sounds for the Hillary docuseries around the archival footage of when she was younger, when she was growing up, and then took those same things and kind of bashed them up for later scenes when she's being attacked in the media and she's become this, you know, vilified figure. So talk to us a little bit about that, about taking those sounds and kind of reimagining the very same thing in a completely different way.
Totally. So one of the first things that I did, sometimes with a documentary you do write chronologically, or at least I find myself doing that. I would say with television and other narrative stuff, I tend to kind of plant myself right in the middle and work my way back, if that makes sense, sort of backwards and forwards, just because that's like the starting place. For I guess sometimes with docs, it's really, you're kind of going through a life story, so it makes more sense to start at the beginning. And with Hillary, that's what I was doing. So I came up with this melody and this palette for her growing up, and her ideals. It's very kind of innocent and beautiful, and there's this sort of woodwind melody with strings, and And we finally kind of got there with that piece, and then it jumps straight away to, I think in that sequence, maybe it goes straight to the election, to 2016, and it's quite jarring. And Nanette really wanted there to be some sort of echo of where we had just come from. So I fed the cue, which was maybe about 30 seconds of it, and put it into the Morphogene, which is a mutable instruments thing, and just kind of hit it over the head with a sledgehammer and took it to pieces and sliced it up so it's kind of granulated, and then created these beds out of it that went through the clouds, which is another thing that I use all the time. I forget who makes it. I'm blanking. Do you know who makes the clouds? I'm sure
have it in the story.
What's that? You have it in the story? Yeah, you do.
You can mix online for that.
Right on. Yeah, I don't know why I'm blanking. Anyway, it's a wonderful module. It's a lot like I have a Eventide H9000, and it kind of reminds me a bit of that. So it has that same wide signature vibe. So I kind of made these sometimes quite haunting and beautiful pads that then I would be able to, again, kind of lay new melodies over. But really, they were kind of born out of that DNA, that initial piece. And sometimes that stuff is super subconscious, but it's helpful for me to know, to have that process. And it's something that I find myself doing quite a lot, like taking stuff that's very finished and just sort of either kind of tearing it apart and like stripping it back until you kind of boil it down to its most basic form, or doing something literal, like putting it into a machine that just chops it into pieces. So yeah, that was the jam with that one.
That works really well with Hillary, just because it does have dual narratives, and
right,
music is kind of connecting those two, because they're very different from each other, because young Hillary is surprisingly very, very different than the Hillary that we know more in present time. So
totally. And I think that's the big thing about that documentary that you walk away from, and it really succeeds in that way. Like, you get to know her entirely. And the stuff, I'm a Brit, so there are huge gaps in my knowledge about her anyway, but to kind of be armed with all that information suddenly makes you really think differently about the present day. And so yeah, that was important to have that thread.
But at the same time, because I think even before anybody sees the Hillary film, they have an opinion about her, and you have to be very careful to not dictate the mood too much. She's already looking bad, or she's looking good. And with Unbelievable, the same way, it's such a sensitive topic. Unbelievable is scripted, but it's based on a true story about a girl who's raped, and who the police poke all kinds of holes in her story and make her go back on what she said, until like some other detectives kind of connect the threads between her rape and a bunch of other ones. I'm just letting people know in case they haven't seen it. And it's very, very sensitive. Everything about it is sensitive. You're really connecting to the character, because you can see exactly how they twisted everything she said. So again, my point is that you have to be very careful with the music, not to dictate the viewer's mood, but kind of support what's happening on the screen. So how do you do that? What kind of conversations are you having with the directors and filmmakers? What kind of direction are they giving you? And how are you making yourself conscious about not overstepping that line?
Right. We talked a lot about it really needing a very light touch, and trying to sort of paint a picture of something that isn't necessarily on the screen. For example, when she's in that horrific sequence in the pilot, when she's being raped and she looks off to the side and she sees the photograph of her at the beach, you're sort of, the note for me was like, be the memory, like do that. Don't do the thing that's happening. Be the kind of way that she's trying to deal with this. And that was, of course, there's a sadness to it, inevitably, but there's something like, this is how she's trying to come to terms with it. And we talked a lot about her sinking underwater to try and escape this, and sonically that was really helpful for me to think about, like the feeling of like falling underwater. And even with some of the more procedural cues, there are like clicks. I love clicks. I've got a thing about clicks. And I found all these like weird ways of making these very specific clicks that sound a bit like sort of when you know, what's it called, DNT, when you're sort of like
punching your jaw and stuff.
Yeah, when you feel that thing in the back of your ears and you can hear it. It's horrible, but I like that stuff. I was trying to kind of recreate that sound, and had like a weird thing going down the back of my amp, and the scraping sounds and just all kinds of crazy nonsense. But you know, that stuff is really internal. That's really the word that the showrunners would use over and over again, is internal. It's really about, like, you know, even with the cops, like, it's about what's going on inside. And honestly, that note only works when performances are awesome, and the performance in that show, they're all just phenomenal. So I'm kind of able to do something that's not necessarily on the page or on the screen, which is really fun, and challenging. And again, you can't get in the way, you can't dictate feeling, so it's tricky. And I think that with that one as well, it was so challenging, or so interesting, that, you know, the lead characters, the protagonists, I guess, don't show up until the end of episode 2. I mean, they're not really together until episode 3, which is like kind of bonkers in a way. But from there, you know, that's when, okay, now we've got some themes, and it's got kind of momentum and propulsion and energy and stuff, and then kind of mixed in with, you know, some of the more elegiac moments from Marie. Yeah, that was fun. I loved that project. It was really something special.
Well, thank you so much for all this insight. You've been doing this for so long. It's so nice to hear it from someone who has so much experience on so many different kinds of picture, from documentaries to series to feature films. And there's tons of Will's work out on streaming services, so you can check it out for yourself. And speak to you soon.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. Great to chat.